I'm just gonna go back to the initial question asked at the beginning of the panel, which was basically, with all this regional, deep, profound regional changes, where should Israel stand? Where should Israel go from there? And basically, very briefly, the two main perspectives you were mentioned. One of them is, of course, that with all this regional upheaval, it's much better to stuck, so to speak, our head in the sand and wait it out. Whereas the other perspective is that, on the contrary, because of this, the region is completely in flux, there is an incentive for Israel to actually change its policies and change its strategies. I'm going to start my brief presentation by outlining my conclusion, which is it's definitely about the latter. It's definitely not about the former. Changes in the region do not give Israel an incentive to stand still. They should, on the contrary, motivate Israeli policymakers to do a 180-degree turn on their strategy. Now, let's see how that should be done. First, I will say a couple of words about regional dynamics, how I see them, and why Israel sees them as a challenge, whereas in reality I think we should see them as both a challenge as well as an opportunity. And then I'll say a couple of words of, practically speaking, how to make the necessary political changes to actually be able to take advantage of this potential opportunity, so to speak. So really, if we look at the Middle East in the past 2 to 3 years, there is absolutely no question that we're witnessing what in political scientists call a critical juncture, which means to completely shift, a completely political, social, and economic possibly shift. I would say that when we're talking about regional revolution, we have to really talk about it through a regional perspective, which means that even if in the news we're mostly seeing the regional upheavals in places like Tunisia or Egypt, where there's been a full-on revolutionary transformation leading to a regime change, the Arab awakening is more than that. It's more than just regime change. It's about deep-seated political debates that have really occurred all over the region. So let's not just look at revolutionary processes that have completed, like in Tunisia and in Egypt, but let's look at the regional perspective. Let's look at massive social and political demonstration and calls for reforms in Oman, in Jordan, in Kuwait, in Palestine, in Morocco. So just to give you a little bit of a initial understanding why I say it's so important to understand that this is a regional phenomenon. And if we have Q&A, I'm happy to talk more about all these individual countries. Now I'll just give an overview that there's revolution, but there's also internal debates happening virtually everywhere. And of course, I mentioned Palestine. Palestine has not had a revolution, but it has had cycles of internal protest surrounding not just social and economic issues, but also surrounding other core issues that are deeply related to the Israel-Palestine conflict, including use of strategic nonviolent struggle around of issues like the prisoners issue, prisoners' rights. So there has been an effect on Palestine as well. So it is a regional phenomenon. What does this regional phenomenon mean? And here I would agree that we're witnessing something generational. I would agree that it's the shattering of the walls of fear, the despotic relation that pre-existed, and the opening of a new society in which social movement, civil society, that has really always been there. It just wasn't as heard, or didn't have the capacity to mobilize as much because it encountered a highly repressive regime, but was still there. But now the civil society and the social movement is one of the main actors, is a new emerging actors all over the region. And as such, and I'll get to Israeli policy in a minute, but this is one of the phenomena that is important to note and to understand. What else is happening? What's happening is post-revolutionary transitions, post-revolutionary stabilization challenges. From Israel's point of view, this means that in the short term, instability is probably a fair expectation. What is the instability? For a number of reasons. I'll mention 3 and then I'll move on. Firstly, renewed instability, and this is something that if you look at all the measurements for state fragility, state failure, and so on and so forth, you will see that they've been going down in the past 2 years. This is not a surprise. Post-revolutionary periods are complicated, they're replete with challenges, and they tend to be unstable. It's generally the nature of post-conflict transition. It's nothing exceptional about the Middle East, it's more the norm. Even so, there are deeply seated challenges that create instability all over the Middle East. I would say the first challenge is that the problems that need to be addressed are deeply structural, deeply embedded, and it will take a long time to address them. From dysfunctional relationship between the citizen and the state to dysfunctional economies. The economies in the Middle East are overall not in a good state. If you look at unemployment, the middle unemployment rate around the region is double compared to the world unemployment rate. And if you look at youth or women unemployment, we're talking about 25%. And we're not even going to go into Palestine because he has additional layers of problems that are, of course, related also to the Israel-Palestine conflict and to the ongoing occupation. But leaving Palestine aside and looking at the other countries, there are still very deeply rooted problems, and it would be naive to think that only a regime change will be enough to change them. This will be a generational sort of struggle, especially when it comes to addressing rising unemployment, increasing social inequalities, and the so-called youth bulge in a region that is extremely characterized by its youth. 60% of people in this part of the world are below the age of 25. This is an important thing, I think, to note, which also explains the revolutionary upheaval in a way. So instability is natural because the problems are deeply rooted and and it will take time to address them. Instability is also because post-revolutionary society are seeing a resurgence of divisions. Now, these divisions take a number of different images, from secular religious to sectarian to clan-based. The resurgence of pre-existing cleavages, again, is the norm, not the exception in post-revolutionary societies. And thirdly, I think there is instability because democratic consolidation takes time, and especially for societies that don't have that experience, it takes a lot of internal bargaining and a lot of internal discussion over what are the rules of the new game. And here you can see it from Egypt to Tunisia. A lot of the press talks about it as a religious Islamist versus secular sort of battle. I think this is a misguided notion. I think here we have revolutionary and counter-revolutionary forces, autocracy and pro-democratic forces. I think there is a general discussion within society about how to accommodate majoritarian democracy with pluralism. This is a very difficult question. I think Israel, by the way, could do some thinking about it as well. But if you put all these things together, you understand why we're witnessing upheaval. Now, where's the problem? The problem is seen from Israel's point of view, and especially if we talk about decision makers in the government, there is a sort of a false sense that instability is by necessarily something to be avoided, and that if we have to choose between democracy in a generation or stability now, we should really go for stability now. This is exactly what the West has been doing in supporting, and have been doing when supporting Ben Ali, when supporting Mubarak, and in supporting Bahrain at the moment, and so on and so forth. I think this is a false dichotomy, and I also think this is very short-sighted, because when you support regimes that are illegitimate and illiberal, and they are, yes, stable from a security perspective, but deeply unstable from a human security perspective, you're really building a castle of sand, which will eventually collapse. And I think that would be a good lesson for Israel to learn from the Arab Spring. So, which brings me at the policy side, and I think I'm doing well with time. Yes, good. So what do I mean? Because there are these generational, deeply structural and deeply dynamic changes, from Israel's point of view, I think there is a call for a rethinking of the paradigm. Before talking about the policies, I will talk about the mindset. I think the number one thing to do is to change the mindset. What is the mindset? The mindset is a mindset that said, before the beginning of the Arab awakening, basically said, we are the only real democracy in the Middle East. The rest of this region is sort of a vacuum with apathic society, people who don't yearn for freedom, don't yearn for democracy. We are sort of the beacon of light. It's an Orientalist thinking. I'm exaggerating it perhaps, but I've heard it over and over. I think the first big thing to do in dealing with the Arab awakening is get rid of that paradigm. It doesn't work. It's wrong. The Orientalist thinking brings you, one, to not understand regions that are changes. Two, it brings you to overestimate the importance of state security and forget the importance of human security and societal security. So I think this would be the first big mindset change. What does that mean? That also means change the way you look at Arab societies, for example. Instead of only thinking about relationship with the palace, so with the upper echelons of power, you need to consider that the public opinion is and will become an important factor in shaping policy. So just talking to, shall we say, the army in a given country, we shall not be named, is not going to work. It's just simply not going to cut it with a rising societies where public opinion does count. So I think the first mindset shift is get rid of Orientalism, get rid of the idea that the societies around the region are so different. They're not, and that the things that are demanded are so different. They're not. It's dignity, it's freedom, it's participation. You can call it democracy if you want, but be that as it may, it's more participatory, free, society based on dignity, freedom, and participation. That's what it is, and it's not so different at all. Second mindset shift. Related to this, Israel is not a villa. It's not a villa in the Middle East. It's not the only force for democracy. It's not the only force for pluralism. And Israel is not a villa in the sense that it cannot shelter itself from the regional changes. This is the second mindset. By thinking you're a villa isolated, by we thinking that we're a villa isolated in a region full of instability and conflict, there is a false assurance that the instability would never arrive, would never get to us. That's simply not possible. Instability, borders are porous. You can build walls, but it's not enough. In other words, the one word summary is you cannot shelter yourself from the changing dynamics in the region. So you might as well deal with it. Now, how do you deal with it? And this is how we get to the big elephant in the room, which is improving relations and status of Israel in the region depends mostly on one issue, and we all know what it is, and it's about the just resolution to the Israel-Palestine conflict. As just mentioned before, most society in the Arab world have no intention of going to war with Israel, but at the same time they see Israeli policies. Again, it's not about ideology, it's about practical policy. They see Israeli policy in the West Bank and in Gaza, which is forgotten these days, as one of the main reasons to oppose normalization, oppose upgrading of the relations. So going back to the main point to which I started, the region is in flux. These dynamics are profound, they are deep. They will lead to shattering, I think, changes in the next 5 to 10 years. I don't think this is I don't think this is the French Revolution, but I don't think it's post 1989 Eastern Europe either. I don't think it will take a year. I don't think it will take 100 years. It's a generational process. Israel should understand this and should embrace the regional change by doing the obvious thing, which is to invest in the Israel-Palestine, on the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian process. And if we have Q&A, I'd love to talk about economic development, which I think would be another excellent topic to discuss in bringing us forward in this particular issue. And finally, when I talk about the Israel-Palestinian conflict, I don't just mean a diplomatic talks with Kerry. I also talk about a strategic rethinking of the policy with respect to Gaza, which I think is also something I love to talk about in the Q&A if I'm running out of time here. But as we mentioned already, the Hamas and Hezbollah are on the losing side of the Arab awakening. They might be where it will very well be so, especially Hamas right now, which is much weaker and looking for international allies after the regime change in Egypt and after Qatar realigning itself and taking us slightly more low profile in its foreign policy. That is the case, but a Hamas that is cornered is not necessarily a Hamas that is amenable to act in a restrained way. So to isolate more, to punish more, besides being against international law, which doesn't seem to stop the policy in the past, it probably won't do it in the future, but it will be one of the main spoiler of any substantial advancement on the Israel-Palestine track.
Thank you very much for this very straightforward, cutting edge, presentation.